Yeah, great. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to talk about Microsoft Graph today. I'm Mike Ammerlaan. I work on the Office Ecosystem Marketing team. I've worked in marketing for about a year, but before that, I worked as a program manager for about 16 years at Microsoft, working on products like SharePoint and Excel, working on some games like Combat Flight Simulator and the like. So I've done a lot of cool things, but I've always tended to focus a little bit on developer technologies and APIs. And so it's definitely my pleasure to sort of talk a little bit about Microsoft Graph today and sort of give you an overview of the capabilities of Microsoft Graph and how you can use it inside of your Xamarin applications. So before we get started, Microsoft Graph isn't just the latest charting technologies from Microsoft. It's actually a comprehensive API that spans across our Office 365 products, but more broadly across Microsoft. If you watched Build, for example, a couple of months ago and some of the keynotes there for developers, Microsoft Graph is actually taking hold across Microsoft as a consistent, integrated API that allows you to access all of the data that your customers may have inside of Office 365 and sort of the Microsoft, things like Azure Active Directory as well, more broadly. So by the end of this session, you'll understand the entire landscape of Microsoft Graph, what's available, how you can take advantage of it, what it looks like. We'll understand all the different types of workloads that are available inside of Microsoft Graph. We'll understand the capabilities that rest on top of Microsoft Graph that you can leverage. And we'll take a look at some code samples of how you can actually take those Graph APIs and start to build business-powered applications with Xamarin inside of it. I think essentially, I hope a punchline that you'll take away from this is, if you're doing any kind of application that's working with, a customer of yours or your company, and your company is using Office 365, there's almost always going to be some reason to, incorporate some data from Microsoft Graph in your application. Maybe it's just, incorporating a user profile and the friendly name of the user who's actually accessing your application. Maybe it's pulling in a little bit of, attaching files from their OneDrive. But there's always different types of capabilities that if you're building a business-powered application, you're going to want to take advantage of. And we'll talk about some examples as well and some ideas for things that you can go and build. So we will talk through some code samples of how to get started working with Microsoft Graph. So you'll have a takeaway of a few samples of both the hello world and a little bit more sophisticated examples. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the roadmap for Microsoft Graph and what's coming up and what you can expect. But Microsoft Graph is sort of expanding across the company. So if nothing else, one takeaway is that there's more and more products that you should expect to see over the coming months and over the coming year that will use the same consistent patterns as Microsoft Graph. So an investment in sort of understanding Microsoft Graph will pay dividends in the future as more and more products that you may be using sort of start to work with it. Okay, so broken down the agenda, we'll talk a little bit about the opportunity and the Office 365 developer landscape. We'll talk a bit about the graph, the basics of using Microsoft Graph, how to get started, the hello worlds, if you will. We'll talk a little bit more about how you can use more advanced capabilities and what those are and how you can leverage them. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a roadmap. Okay, so just talking a little bit about Microsoft Graph itself, and more specifically Office 365. Office 365 recently just crossed the 100 million monthly commercial active users threshold. So, in businesses and organizations all across the world, over 100 million customers, are using Office 365. And in fact, as you can imagine, for a lot of those users, they're living in Outlook, maybe they're living in Microsoft Teams, maybe they're working with files in SharePoint. They're using it probably for hours and hours a day. And so, if you can, for example, improve their productivity by 10% by providing them, an Outlook integration or maybe a connection from your application to Office 365, you can really seriously make the companies and organizations that you work with in your own company, just that much more productive. Of course, also with 100 million commercial monthly active users, it's really sort of spreading across a lot of different companies. Now, 90% of Fortune 500 companies are using some sort of data in Microsoft Graph, whether that's Office 365 or just core profile information inside of Azure Active Directory. Of course, almost any company that uses or has some sort of Azure presence will have some data in Azure Active Directory, and that data is available to you through Microsoft Graph. Of course, Office 365 is also growing amongst small and medium businesses, over 50,000 per month. And then finally, if you think about it, Microsoft Graph, if you've got a company that's really invested in using it, really you can think of Microsoft Graph as the API to to that organization, because all of their meetings and all of their files and their mails, we have over 8 trillion resources available in Microsoft Graph today, and these are really valuable objects that sort of, in a lot of companies, can really be the kind of the lifeblood of the company, all of their intellectual, property, data, files, emails, those kinds of things. And of course, with the right permissions and the right security, you can have access to those from within your application. So there's really just a broad scope of what you can do with Microsoft Graph. Now, when you think about Microsoft Graph, it does start with this concept of a graph, which is to say, you can start with this network of connections. For example, you can use the APIs to look up information about yourself or the logged in user. And you can find out that user's, name and position and maybe their location inside of the company, which office they're in, for example. And so even just being able to get that person's information is very important. But from there, Microsoft Graph is a REST API, and through REST semantics, you can then access their organization information, where they are in the sort of organizational hierarchy. You can find out who's reporting to them, and maybe you can say, well, you know what, I want to go find not just Mike's availability, but I want to find out the availability of all the reports who work for Mike. Not that reports work for me, but imagine that they did. You can also get, for example, the contacts. So you can get the entire network of our sub team just by sort of asking for the contacts from me and from the contacts from all of my reports. The other really important thing in Office 365 that's this emerging concept is something called groups. So groups are a sort of a new organizing concept inside of Office 365. Quite simply, they're a list of users, and they have basically a security concept around them. So you could have your marketing team as one group, and then you have 20 people who are a member of that, and that's the marketing group, and then you can use that as a security concept. But more importantly, in Office 365, groups also serve, for example, every team that you're going to create will have a corresponding group behind it. And every group that you're going to create is going to have a corresponding SharePoint site behind it, and some planner tasks and some files that come from that SharePoint site. So, the group is kind of this, center of the universe of these collaborative teams that you might have inside of your company. And so a lot of times you're going to want to, for example, find out all the members of a group, or use that as a structured concept, potentially inside of your application. And of course, all of that data is available through the Microsoft Graph. Now, of course, all of the artifacts that belong to groups and people also are in Graph. So things like the set of content, documents, tasks, the set of calendar events. We even have some things, for example, from Azure Active Directory. So the set of devices that a particular user may have registered would also show up in the Graph. And it also expands into their conversations, their chats, their emails, all connected together. The final thing that we have is not just data inside of Microsoft Graph, but we also have a concept of intelligence that is exposed throughout it. So, as you work, for example, you're sharing documents with people, people are viewing your documents. What Office 365 does, optionally behind the scenes, if administrators have it turned on, we'll start to aggregate these insights about who's actually working together, not just based on, me being in the same group as my boss or me reporting to my boss, but based on the actual files that we're working on together. And so there are these insights that exist that are exposed that are based on just the actual real working relationships between people. And you can also leverage that. You can leverage things like documents that have a lot of high viewership, so that you're maybe always showing the most relevant documents to people inside of your application. You can find the set of documents that are shared. So a lot of these sort of senses of activity that are going on inside of your organization, you can also pull in through Microsoft Graph. So when we think about the Office 365 platform, really at the base of it, just backing up a little bit, Microsoft Graph really sits underneath it. We think of it as the sort of the API layer to everything inside of Office 365. Now, there is an asterisk there, which is to say that a lot of products in Office 365, like SharePoint or other applications, they still have per product APIs that they may be using for some operations. And so, in some cases, you may still want to use SharePoint specific APIs to go access some more esoteric data inside of SharePoint and those kinds of things. But wherever possible, we're moving all of the applications in Office 365 to use Graph, not just as their API to the world, but also even internally as the API that they use to connect their user experiences up to the data in the Office 365 backend. One other really cool thing about this I should mention is that Microsoft Graph, it's sort of this integral part of Office 365, but we're also working on some hybrid technologies as well. So If you've got Exchange 2016 on premises, there's a preview of a way to actually expose your on-premises Exchange data through Microsoft Graph, in preview, so that if I'm a developer and I'm building an application and I want to work with a customer's, corporate email, so to speak, I don't necessarily have to worry about whether they actually have Office 365 or whether they are working on premises. They've got their own on-premises Exchange server. It just abstracts that for me, and I get one consistent API for working with that. Now, that's a preview capability of being able to access on-premises data through Microsoft Graph, but we think it's a little bit directional in terms of where we expect Microsoft Graph will grow to. And as a developer, we hope that it'll be the one-stop shop for everything that you'll need from Microsoft more broadly. Now, of course, in Office, we have ways to layer on user experiences on top of Microsoft Graph, and you have ways to integrate through web pages with things like documents in Word, or conversations in Microsoft Teams or in Outlook, or pages in SharePoint. But of course, we're also talking about Xamarin today, and so typically what we expect we're going to see is people who build mobile applications, hopefully using Xamarin, connecting to the Microsoft Graph as well. So, there's a lot of ways to extend Office, and there's a lot of ways to build applications to it, but what they have in common is Microsoft Graph is the core. Now, one other thing I'll mention on top of that as well is Microsoft Graph is also unified across our corporate and sort of consumer offerings. So if you want to work with, for example, OneDrive for consumers, the OneDrive that you have inside of Windows that maybe stores, your pictures and all those kinds of things. Microsoft Graph is also an API for working with that as well. So it's unified not just in terms of, companies and Office 365, but also unified across a number of our consumer properties as well. I'm going to talk about it mostly in the Office 365 context, but something to put in the back of your mind, that if you're just building a simple application that's going to live in an app store, if you want some simple integration to read and write files to OneDrive, basically all these techniques will work for that as well. Okay, so let's talk about the basics. I'm going to divide this into two categories. I'm going to talk about the data layer in terms of, Microsoft Graph is basically a sort of a read, write, update type of data store for all the different types of data artifacts that you're going to see in Office 365. Then I'll talk a little bit about the capabilities that are layered on top of the data that make it easier to work with data in more powerful ways, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. So starting with the data. The fundamental concept is that there's one endpoint for Microsoft Graph, and that's https graph.microsoft.com. So this is your one-stop shop. The beauty of this, for example, is that you don't need to, for example, ask a user, hey, user, I want to build this great application for you that's going to connect to your Outlook calendar. Oh, but first you have to tell me what the URL is of your Office 365 tenancy. No, you don't have to do that anymore. It's actually now unified under one endpoint, https graph.microsoft.com. And so your application just has to call into that, and from there you'll get access to data like those users and groups, Excel data, Outlook, calendars, OneNote, Teams, all those different things that you see listed below. The other beauty of this is that you only have to authenticate once against this endpoint. So, I've worked as a program manager working on various APIs for a good long while now. And, typically the process would be, hey, I work on the SharePoint team. We're going to come up with some SharePoint REST APIs. We're maybe going to come up with our own sort of, way to sign in, try to work with other teams to make those APIs consistent. But what you typically find is that across these different products, the APIs would have a little bit of quirks and differences, and maybe you'd actually even need to sign into different services to connect to SharePoint versus connecting to Exchange. Well, now no more. Now it's just one endpoint, and you sign in once, you get your token, you ask for the permissions for the data that you're going to need, and you're ready to go. Now, we are continually adding new APIs to Microsoft Graph. So Microsoft Teams is a new product that's been available since November, and we're adding Graph API for Microsoft Teams. It allows you to get the set of channels and groups that are available to them. We have something called Project Roam, which is this Windows initiative to make it easier to share application state regardless of the devices that you're on. We have SharePoint Sites APIs. Those are now gone generally available, so you can access the hierarchy of SharePoint sites that exist in an organization and work with the files, not just in people's OneDrives, but also that exist inside of SharePoint sites. And then finally, we have things like OneNote APIs that are now generally available as well. So that's kind of a brief overview of graph.microsoft.com. Any questions thus far, or I'll keep going? All right.
No, yeah, it's really cool technology too.
So we're great. Yeah. Well, let's take a look at what this looks like.
So, and actually, you know what? Correct me if I'm wrong. I just heard a few weeks ago that for the first time ever, Office 365 actually brought in more revenue than Office, like the traditional Office. Is that correct?
Yeah,
So
that's
Office
right. That's
365 is
right.
growing really, really big.
Yeah, no. So Office 365, brings in, it's a growing business for Microsoft if you just look at earnings, but I think that's sort of a signifier of, there's, more customers than not sort of choosing to invest in Office 365 and the cloud and those kinds of things, as evidenced by, there's just a lot more people growing in Office 365. Now, of course, I work on the SharePoint team. We've got an on-premises product. We're investing in that, and we know that there's a lot of customers that want to stay on-premises. So we're there to support them, whether they want to stay on-premises or maybe ideally, go in the cloud with Office 365. But yeah, Office 365 is, financially, or sort of in terms of customer adoption, kind of on a tear. If you'll
Well,
if you'll
yeah, and
forgive the marketing guy saying it, but yeah, it's doing pretty well.
but yeah, because with the more people using it, the more valuable the graph gets, right?
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so we actually do have a couple of questions here.
Yeah,
If since I already interrupted you once, is there
no.
a concept of progressive authorization? So start with a small set of permissions and then add more later.
Yeah, so we actually do have, now previously we had an endpoint that you'd register your application and you'd register for the set of permissions that you have up front in terms of, here's just, the 5 permissions that I'm gonna need, and so it was fixed. But we actually have a new version 2 endpoint for Azure Active Directory, which is how we authenticate with Microsoft Graph, that allows you to dynamically declare the set of permissions that you're gonna want over time. So you can start with a smaller set of permissions, and then, as your application sees fit, then potentially register with more permissions. And the user will have to grant them, of course, in terms of saying, yes, I accept the fact that this now is asking for access to my files. But yeah, there's now dynamic permissions that you can change over time.
Cool. And one more. Can we do workflow conception? Like each user has to validate a task with Microsoft Graph.
Like each user has to validate a task. We have
So like
sort
epic
of a,
workflow, basically, where
yeah, workflow. So we have a technology called Microsoft Flow. So Microsoft Flow, what it lets you do is sort of start to establish a set of, sort of basically workflows amongst a number of different, a number of different sort of data types. And so maybe I'll just show you real quick while I'm here. But so let me go. So if you have Office 365, you have Microsoft Flow and you have Microsoft Power Apps. Power Apps lets you build user experiences. Microsoft Flow lets you build, simple workflows. But if I go Flow, and I'll be really brief, but let me go into Flow. You can sort of establish these kinds of workflows, sort of these conditionals that happen that you can see. So for example, in this case, when a new tweet is created, go post a list item into SharePoint and those kinds of things. So there's a whole set of connectors that allow you to connect to a lot of different data sources across Microsoft, things like SharePoint and Outlook and planner tasks and those kinds of things. In addition to connectors that allow you to connect to the rest of the world, things like Twitter or different types of CRMs and those kinds of things. And so, and a lot of these connectors under the covers are powered by Microsoft Graph. And in addition, with Microsoft Flow, you can create your own custom connectors as well. So for the scenario that you're asking about, like for example, approvals for, maybe when a new SharePoint item gets created or when a task gets created, Microsoft Flow is sort of exists to let you do that. And a lot of these connectors that you would be using, they are behind the scenes powered by Microsoft Graph, and you can of course write custom connectors that use Microsoft Graph in addition. So yeah, hopefully that answers it. But
yeah,
Microsoft Graph kind of powers a lot of that. Okay, so let's take a look at what this actually looks like from the developer perspective. So as I mentioned, Microsoft Graph is REST-based APIs, and so once you sign into graph.microsoft.com/v1.0 for our production version 1.0 endpoint, then you can sort of simply start to append these types of suffixes to your requests. You can do a get at /users/micam, which is my email alias. And from there, you'll get some basic information about me, not just my display name and title, but of course my location and a lot of other different types of demographic information. Now, you can also get my photo. So how many times do you want to build an application where you just want to show the user's profile picture in the upper right-hand corner? To do that, I just say /micam//photo and then $value, and that will get you the binary blob that represents my photo that's been uploaded and managed by the user across Office 365. This is kind of our, this is kind of our victory scenario because it, previously, before Microsoft Graph, actually getting the user's picture actually used to be really hard because it was stored separately in different products in different ways, and Graph makes it a snap to get at that. Now, if you actually want to start traversing the graph, you can do things like get my manager, Rob, by just appending /manager. If you wanted to get my direct reports, assuming that I had some, you would be able to get that through /direct reports. And of course, as you can imagine, if I wanted to get a photo of my manager, you just say /manager /photo $value as well. Now, you can also find which groups I'm a member of. And again, we think of groups as really this sort of key organizational concept that we're organizing more and more of Office 365 around. You can find that, oh, okay, I'm a member of the Office marketing group, and here's all my colleagues in marketing. Maybe I'm a member of the basketball league or something like that as well. So you can find out all the different types of ad hoc groups that have been created that I might be a member of. Then from there, you can do things like get all the data artifacts, whether they're associated with me or whether they're associated with my group. There's a set of things that you can access from those sort of, those major, nouns that you might see inside of your organization. So if I want to get my OneDrive files, I just go through /me/drive/root. And it's kind of a directory structure, as you'd imagine, but at the root you can find all the files that are listed, PowerPoints, XLSs, images, those kinds of things. There's a really cool capability in Microsoft Graph where you can actually access Excel spreadsheets. So what you can do is actually you can build this Excel spreadsheet, you can identify some named ranges in the spreadsheet, and then through Graph and through REST API concepts, you can update cells in the spreadsheet, have it recalc, have it give you a value. And so in that regard, you can actually use Excel as both a charting engine, as a calculation engine, through REST to, for example, maybe if you've got a loan model or an actuarial model, that kind of thing, really arbitrarily complex, you can access that and use it as a calculation engine through Graph APIs. You access the file through OneDrive, and then you start a session where you work with a workbook, and away you go. You can get to the user's contacts and events and those kinds of things, their email, so you can send emails through a user's account with Microsoft Graph. You can access their OneNote, SharePoint sites, devices, and conversations as well. Now, in addition, we have more advanced things. We have that concept of insights, which is those sort of aggregated insights that Office 365 computes in the background based on who's viewing documents, who's doing what with documents. So, for example, if everybody's looking at the the company meeting PowerPoint, that would show up inside of /trending, and then you could maybe expose that to users as something interesting that they might want to see. We show you a list of files that you might have recently worked with. So that's /me/drive/recent. So this is a really key one. So one of the best user experience improvements that we've done, for example, inside of Outlook, when you're writing a new email, which of course everyone does, and you want to attach a file, it used to be that you get that standard file browser dialog and you'd have to go find it. But what they added to it was just a simple API call to go /me/drive/recent. And what they pulled back is just a little drop down that will show you the top 5 recent files that you've worked with. So now when you actually attach a file inside of Outlook, it just says, okay, here's the 5 recent files you've worked on. And of course, chances are, if you're sending out an email, you probably were just working on that PowerPoint. So it makes it really easy for users to find the file. So that's probably one of the most loved features we've done in the past year or two. And with Microsoft Graph, it's as easy as just an API call and sort of populating a dropdown, and away you go. So if nothing else, even simple things like people pickers or file pickers or those kinds of things, you'd probably want to use something like Microsoft Graph for it. You can do things like search as well. So for example, if you want to search for people who have a particular attribute, you can do that. And then finally, we have some methods that are exposed through Microsoft Graph. So a popular one is find meeting times. We do expose all the calendar data, but actually taking 5 people's calendar and doing all the overlap computation to find some ideal meeting times, it's not really a trivial exercise. And so we've wrapped the logic that we have for finding available meeting times into an API, and you as a developer can say, here's the 5 people I'd like, here's the meeting duration, go get me that the set of maybe potentially candidate meeting times that I can then show to user experience in my user experience. Okay. All right, so let's get started and start working with it. So as I mentioned,
one question here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no.
How about the interaction with Microsoft Graph with other products on the market? So things like OpenStack, Object OpenStack, Swift, things like that.
You mean in terms of like API, SDKs and those kinds of things?
I believe so. So
yes,
if you want to, yes, SDKs, he says.
Yeah, so we have a number of SDKs. I don't think we have SDKs. We have an iOS SDK. Honestly, I should know this, but I would think that it should work well in Swift. I haven't tested that myself, quite frankly. With OpenStack, I'm not as sure. We do have some SDKs for things like Ruby, for ASP.NET, of course, for PHP. That are available, and so those are available, and we're sort of growing our set of SDKs over time. The other thing I just add is that this is maybe a sort of a cheap excuse, but we also hope that the REST APIs are also so simple that even if there isn't an SDK, people find it very approachable and able to get going. But take that for what it's worth. Hopefully you'll see, and maybe you'll agree with me, that even in the absence of an SDK, it should be fairly straightforward to get started.
Yeah,
and I'll talk about the full set of SDKs in just a sec.
So every platform and every language is going to have some way to call a REST API. So if nothing else, you can still use it.
Yeah,
definitely.
Exactly. So when it comes time to call the API, as I mentioned, graph.microsoft.com is the sort of the core endpoint, and it's just a standard REST type of syntax. So you use things like HTTP verbs to indicate whether you want to read, create a new item, update it, or delete the item. Now we have two versions. There's a v1.0 suffix that you will add to that for the production endpoints. We have a number of APIs that are in beta, so if nothing else, just go to graph.microsoft.com, which is also where we have our documentation and our tools. Just take a look and scroll through the different sets of objects that we have both in v1.0 and beta. It's kind of, for me, it's a little bit of a kid in the candy store because there's just so many different types of objects you can work with, and you're going to want to look across both version 1.0 or beta. Now from there, as we've shown, you can get the set of resources, things like users or groups or drives or those kinds of things. You can get collections and members from collections using standard identifiers that might be available. In some cases with users, you can use both like the sort of the internally generated identifier for a user or their email address if that exists. For properties, you can access them specifically by appending the REST endpoint. So you can get all of the properties for a user by just going through /user/AAA here. But if you want to get their department specifically, you can then append a suffix as well. And then from there, you can sort of traverse to other related objects that sort of extend off that particular item. Now, the other thing about this API is it supports a lot of OData type of query parameters. So being able to do things like sorting and filtering, being able to say, for context, there's 27 different fields, but for the sake of efficiency, I only want these 5 fields. You can do a select. You can do filtering. You can do expansion, so if you want to, expand the sub-objects in a parent object, so to get those parent-child relationships in one call, you can do that. And then, of course, there's concepts of paging with, select the top 20 items, give me a token, and then as I want to go through page 2, page 3, page 4, I pass you in the token that will get page number 2, page number 3, page number 4. So there's those common OData type of semantics for, doing slightly more advanced things that are supported across the API endpoints. So with that, I want to take you to Graph Explorer. So if you go to graph.microsoft.com, let me go to graph.microsoft.com. Again, this is the API endpoint that you're going to want to call. In this case, it'll actually redirect you to developer.microsoft.com. But you'll see that there's the documentation, some quick starts, the SDKs, which we'll talk about in just a second. Documentation, take a look and scroll through the different endpoints and those kinds of things. But one of the key things that we have here is something called Graph Explorer. So this is just a way to test Graph Explorer in the browser and to go experiment with it. Now, you don't even need to have an account in Office 365 to get started. If you actually load this up without signing in, I'm signed in, as you can see over here. If you go visit the site without signing in, there's some test data that you can start to work with that allows you to explore a lot of things. But the test data doesn't allow you to make reads and writes and updates, back via Graph. So at some point, you're probably going to want to have an Office 365 tenancy that you can experiment with. Now, the good news is if you want to have an Office 365 tenancy you can experiment with, you can simply go to dev.office.com. And on the home page, there's a developer program you can sign up for. And as a result of signing up for this developer program, one of the things you'll get is sort of your own Office 365 test tenancy that you can experiment with. So, I'm using mikeamm.onmicrosoft.com, which is my developer tenancy. I highly recommend it. It's obviously a little bit more comforting as a developer to work with test data rather than actually working with your real corporate directory. And so you can feel free more to experiment. So I definitely recommend getting a test tenancy. Okay, let's go back to the Graph Explorer. as you can see, I've already signed in. And so if I want to, I can just do the simple call up here to https graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me, and you can see from here I'm just getting some basic information about me. Here's my title, my email address, my office location, and mobile phone. Now, what I can do if I'm interested is I can then turn around and do things like, okay, maybe I actually want to go ahead and update my information. So I'll do a patch request, take the response that I got from the GET, just paste that back in. Go select it one more time. Let's see like this. Okay, and now if I want to change my office location from Redmond to Hawaii like so, I'll just update it, and again, then just make this query. It'll go to the server, and so now if I go switch back to a GET request to go read the data, what you should see is that my office location has now been updated to Hawaii. So again, just standard REST semantics. You get this JSON blob that comes back when you do a GET, and if you want to make a patch and update, you just do the patch and update that sort of same type of JSON blob back to the server. It will update your data, to the level of your permissions. Of course, I can't update my boss's office location or those kinds of things if I wanted to. Now, if you wanted to get my photo, I don't know why you would, but if you wanted to get my photo, you could do that through /photo/$value, and that actually returns a sort of a binary version of my photo that you could then go show in sort of maybe a profile dropdown, that kind of thing. If you want to look at my email, /me/messages, you can find here's all the sort of a JSON representation of my inbox in a sense. You'll see all the messages and the body and all the sort of the standard email stuff about who it's from and those kinds of things. So you can start to work with email and also send email by doing things like a put. Now, another interesting thing that you can then go do is see all of my OneDrive files. So that's /me/drive/root. Think of it like a file system, and then you're just getting all the children, all the files in the root of my OneDrive. So from here, you'll see, here's a listing of all the files that I have, and again, the core metadata around them. Here's what the URL is, download URL if you want to go download it. So this is all the set of files that I have available in my OneDrive. Another good example is all the calendars I have. So in this case, here's a representation of all the events in my calendar. I'm doing a get against /me/events, and I'm selecting a subset of the set of properties that are possibly exposed through an event. An event can be a very complicated thing. You can have recurrences and all that kind of thing going on. If you're building a mobile application, obviously you want to be very thrifty with however many bytes you request over the wire. So you're going to want to be doing things like this select semantic to make sure that you only pull down the fields that you need. So yeah, then if I want to go so this is my calendar, and so you can see I've got a number of different meetings that are scheduled. If I want to go create a meeting, I'll go back to Graph Explorer, do a schedule new meeting. I'll say, hello Xamarin like this. And again, very simple, body, just a start time and an end time. Of course, there's, probably a couple dozen properties that I can sort of work with if I want to add a description and those kinds of things. But I'm just going to do a post to /me/events. And if I go back to my calendar, you can see I'm now late for that meeting that I just scheduled. But yeah, so now it just shows up inside of my calendar, and it's available there for me. So you get the idea. There's a lot of different ways to update. The cool thing about this is this Graph Explorer was updated about 2 months ago to add, just this library of samples that you can look at. So for example, if I'm interested in working with Excel data, I can go turn on this set of samples and I can start to experiment with Excel data. And so this gives you a great way to actually model the kinds of graph requests you're going to want to do. It's a lot of great code samples, if you will, and shows you the breadth of what's possible for working with different types of concepts inside of Microsoft Graph. Okay, so that's just a brief, quick look at the sort of just working with the endpoints. Now, as we were talking about, there are a number of different SDKs. So, there's server-side SDKs for things like ASP.NET, for things like PHP and Python and Ruby. There's obviously client SDKs if you want to work with iOS or Android or UWP natively. We have basically a .NET SDK that supports .NET Standard 1.1, so it works inside of Xamarin, and we're going to be talking about that in more detail. But there are a number of different SDKs that are available. Most of the samples I do, I tend to sort of just use the raw APIs, natively, just making outbound HTTP web requests. But the beauty of the SDKs is it gives you a more structured object semantic for working with, again, structured objects that represent all the concepts like an event and a contact and those kinds of things. So a number of these SDKs are now generally available, as you can see here, and a number of them are still in preview that we're working on. So the iOS and the Ruby and the Python ones are still being iterated on, and we're taking feedback, but they are available for you to get started and take a look at and give us feedback on. There's also a direct integration in Visual Studio for connecting to Microsoft Graph and doing a little bit of modeling through that, but honestly, graph.microsoft.com is also a great tool for that as well. Now, probably the most interesting part and maybe the trickiest part of working with Microsoft Graph, as maybe you could have guessed, is the authentication. So under the covers, Microsoft Graph supports standard OAuth 2 against the Azure Active Directory, and that's kind of the issuer of the OAuth tokens that you're going to need to want to use to authenticate against Microsoft Graph. So typically what you're going to do is use a library like MSAL, the Microsoft Authentication Library, that's now in preview, that provides a lot of features like support across both consumer and commercial sets of data. It has that sort of dynamic, for example, scoping capability, so you can specify the scopes on the fly. So it has a number of capabilities inside of it. It's still in preview, but we'll be showing that today. There's an older authentication library called ADAL. The Active Directory Authentication Library, I believe, is what that stands for. So you may see some references to that, and you can also use that as well, but we're going to use the newer production ready preview. It's not generally available, but hopefully it's getting close. Now there's two ways to register it, I should mention. You can either register an application in Azure if you go to Azure and then you go to Active Directory, within that, you'll find that there's a way to sort of create new application registrations, which you can work through. But you don't need Azure. There's actually even a simpler flow through apps.dev.microsoft.com, which I'll show you, to go register your application and go get your sort of identifier. So it's essentially a sort of a standard flow where your application will call into Microsoft Identity, with your ID token. You'll get back both an access token and a refresh token. MSAL will handle a lot of the sort of the access token, refresh token type of semantics so that you get an up-to-date access token, because those tend to have a sort of I believe it's 2-hour type of expiry. And then once you have your access token that's up to date, you can then go use that to call into Microsoft Graph. Okay, so these are the actual samples we're going to sort of talk through and get started with Xamarin to go code against. They're available in GitHub, so we'll share the slides, I'm sure after the session, and you can sort of go download these samples and start working with them. But we'll get started. Now, the first of these, Active Directory-Xamarin-Native-V2, that's kind of our recommended starter sample. It basically adds the MSAL sort of library that's still in preview. It adds that to your projects, your Xamarin projects, so that you can get started working with that. Of course, you can also just add MSAL, the preview, to your existing projects as well if you want to get started that way. But let's take a quick look at and get started actually developing. Okay, so the first thing we're going to want to do is actually register our custom application. So I'm going to go back to my browser, and I'm just going to go to, let me just type it in, so apps.dev.microsoft.com. So I'll sign in with in my case, I sign in with my live ID, and so this shows me all the applications I've created. Been doing a lot of different demos, but if I want to create a new application, I can just simply say add an app, and I'll give this a name, Xamarin Training, and click create. And that will then basically give me my new application registration. I'll get an identifier, which is a GUID basically, that sort of represents the identity of my application. This is the thing I'm going to want to sort of copy around and work with. Now, when I want to basically set this up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I want this to be a native application. I want to use it inside of mobile applications and the like. I could also add web, and I could add server-side web API as different platforms to work with. And it's going to give me some custom redirect URIs that I can use inside of my application. Now, I can also specify permissions. Now, as I said earlier, you can actually dynamically specify these, but this is kind of like a default. If you're using the sort of the newer endpoints and the newer SDKs, if you're using the older endpoints and the older SDKs, this is sort of your de facto set of permissions. If you're using the newer endpoints, that V2 endpoint, which MSAL uses behind the scenes, you can dynamically specify your permissions. In my case, I'm going to say, in addition to being able to read the fundamental properties of a user, the other thing I want to do is actually want to be able to read their list of SharePoint sites. So I'll select sites.read.all. But you can see the set of permissions here that are available. This is just a wide set of permissions that you can access: calendars, contacts, all kinds of different things, typically read and write, versus just read. That's all available. And we'll talk a little bit about, the difference between, admin consent and user consent and those kinds of things. Okay, so I'm just going to select those, and then I'm pretty much done. I'll hit save. And so now I've got this. Let me go copy the application identifier like so. Okay, so now I've created my application. So this, I'm going to come over to my sample over here. And so this is just a very simple sample. It's basically the starter sample, I should say, of building a Xamarin application using Microsoft Graph. In my app.cs, my main application object, I've declared a few properties here. The most interesting one is this public client application. This is sort of the main object, which will represent the state of my signed in authentication tokens with Azure Active Directory, which let me access Microsoft Graph. I've got the client ID, so this is some configuration information that we have here. So in my case, I'll replace it with that new one that I just created. Here's the set of scopes that I'm going to dynamically request. So this will take precedence. I didn't actually have to probably add sites.read.all when I was actually setting up my application, because here I'm going to dynamically say, here's the permissions that I need. And from there, it does a little bit of initialization in the app constructor to instantiate that public client application. Now, if you actually look at the code, what you'll see here is, when the form appears, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, has the user already signed in? Do we already actually have an active token that's available to us? Maybe it needs to be refreshed, but do we actually have an existing token? If we do, then therefore the user is signed in, go update our user data, and then go change that sign in, sign out button to sign out. But if we don't have an existing token, then we're going to just ask the user to go ahead and sign in. And when the user clicks the sign in button, what we'll do is we'll call app.publicclientapplication.acquire token async, which will kick off the sign in process. And then when that successfully completes, we'll go update our user data. So this is just basically a simple implementation of a sign in, sign out button, login process type of thing. Now, this is the code where, assuming we've signed in and assuming we've got a valid token, here you can see we're just doing some very basic, REST request 101 here. We're going to instantiate an HTTP client. We're going to go create an outbound message that's going to call, let me scroll over, graph.microsoft.com/v.1.0/me. We're going to append that token that we have to the bare HTTP header. So that's going to basically sign us in and give us that permission. And then we're just going to do, again, REST 101, which is send off the request. And if it's successful, we'll go parse it using Newtonsoft's, JSON parsing link functionality to go extract the data and just go on from there. So really kind of a hello world. In this case, I'm just going to run it against UWP to keep it simple, like this. So it's really just a hello world. It's going to go boot up. Now I'm going to have to sign in the first time because I've changed the application identifier, so I need to sign into the service with my credentials, and then I'm going to have to give it permission. All right, loading up. So, you can imagine, maybe more exotic login screens and those kinds of things if you so choose. Keep in mind that MSAL is going to do the work to sort of host a web browser, which will actually do the sort of the real sign-in work. So I just click sign in. That's going to cause MSAL to pop up this dialog. I'm going to say mike@mikeam.onmicrosoft.com. Okay, sign in. You notice that the application title that I just gave it is showing up here. So you can do things like have a splashier logo or splashier sort of title, of course. Click sign in. Now then I get the permission prompt, which says here's the set of things that it's going to want to do. It's going to want to sign in as me. That's kind of the fundamental stuff. That read all items in all site collections, that permission that I added, that's showing up here as well. And I'll just click accept. And so now, I think I accidentally, hold on, it threw an exception. I think what I actually did was I actually hit the sign in button twice because I was a little nervous. All right, let's try that again one more time.
It happens.
Yeah, it happens. It happens. Okay, well now I'm getting an exception. That's not cool. That shouldn't happen. All right, let's try this. Okay, well, let me just do something real quick. Okay, let me go back to this and let me just use the token I was using before, like so. Try this one more time. Okay, booting up. Let's see, let's try this one more time. Oh, yeah, so, okay, let me go sign in. You can see it's using a different application that I've used before. This, click sign in once. And see, now since I had granted that application permissions before, it didn't have to ask me permissions a second time. I just had to sign in. And in this case, the application will just go ahead and show me some very basic, demographic information that's coming from that /me endpoint that I showed you earlier. Now, the next thing I want to show is just extending it very simply. I'm going to go into my Xamarin form here. I'm just going to paste in a little bit more XAML, essentially a stack layout with a table view. What I want to do is now I want to pull in some very basic SharePoint information from this user's SharePoint site. So I've added some simple XAML here, and then let me just go add some very simple, almost crude, if you will, some JSON parsing code. So let me just do that, like so. So you can see here what I'm going to do is just go make a separate outbound request to the set of sites and the set of lists. Now this is a beta endpoint, so I have to call that /beta sub URL of graph.microsoft.com to get the list of lists. So a very simple REST request. I'm going to go then parse the result and then go push it into that table that I put inside of my XAML. So now when I just go and start this application, again, just very hello world, now, it should automatically sign me in because it has my token, and so I don't need to sign in a second time. That's what MSAL is doing for me. And then it'll just go ahead and list my SharePoint site information. And from there, you can do things like, for example, get the set of files that people might have inside of their lists and those kinds of things. So you can really get do some very powerful things working with files that a user may have stored inside of their SharePoint sites. So here, it's going to request. Now you can see here's my default SharePoint site, mikeamm.sharepoint.com, and here's the set of lists that are available on my SharePoint site. In fact, you can see that there's a lot of lists that are typically hidden from a user, like my content type sync log, but you can access those, and if you wanted to work with that data, you could go do so. So this is just a very simple example of going ahead and sort of connecting to Microsoft Graph. I'm not quite sure why I was getting that exception, but anyway, you can go to apps.dev.microsoft.com. You can see how easy it is to create an account and then just go from there and start working with Graph. Okay, so that was a little bit of the hello world. Was there questions?
Yeah, we got one more question now. Can I use the same token to access other RESTful services? And should it be in the same domain? So I think at the beginning, you kind of mentioned that there's a ton of different services we can connect to. Do we use the same token for all of them?
So I think, for example, I think you should be able to use the same token to register, for example, for Azure B2C services as well. So if you've got Azure B2C services that you've created, like your own custom web services that are authenticating with Azure Active Directory, you should be able to, register using the same token and get at them as well. Now that's something that you're probably going to need to use the Azure Active Directory registration tool to actually go register and work with. But yeah, you should be able to do other Azure, B2C services and maybe some other Azure Active Directory APIs. But I think that's probably the universe of things. Now, of course, that can be almost any arbitrary service if they've sort of worked with Azure Active Directory to register. But yeah.
Great, thanks.
Okay. So let's go step into a little bit more of an advanced example. So this one's just a little bit more of an extended hello world. So let's put it this way. In this case, I'm gonna go sort of push it to my Android emulator. So this also uses MSAL. So what this is gonna do is just simply show me a list of contacts available inside of Android, and then I can also see for a given contact the set of files. Now, that contact has to be actually a user inside of my Active Directory because you can't associate files with just your arbitrary contacts, but it just shows some basic concepts of working with it. So in this case, so rather than actually using just direct outbound HTTP client REST calls, I'm gonna actually use the .NET SDK. So I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like, but I'm gonna sign in here. And in this case, the way this sample is written is a little bit unfortunate. It doesn't actually ask to say, does the user already have an active token? If yes, automatically sign them in. It's doing something a little bit more basic here. It's just going to ask me to sign in every time. I can pick this account that I've already signed in with, and it's taken me to a menu where it'll show me the list of contacts that I have. So I can see all the contacts that are coming out of my address book. And then for a user who's actually in my directory, if I click on them, what it'll do is it'll show me a set of files. So fairly simple, a little bit of a hello world. But you can see here, it's broken down into a number of different pages and different forms. And this contacts page, which actually lists the set of contacts, again, you're going to see what it's going to do here is it's going to call into a set of code that they've written in something called Authentication Helper. So if I go look at Authentication Helper, what you'll see is it does a lot of the same kind of code to sort of acquire a token when the user signs in. It uses that MSAL library to sort of basically get that token and sort of make it available. And then it's going to use a .NET SDK from Microsoft Graph. And the primary object that you have with that .NET SDK is something called Graph Service Client. That's kind of the hub object. And so what it'll do is for all the downstream code that actually wants to work with graph data, it's going to go instantiate a Graph Service Client that you see here. It's going to go pass in the token at the right time to make sure that the Graph Service Client is authenticated. And then from there, I've got this live Graph Service Client that I can use to go call into, Microsoft Graph data. So in the context page, the way this manifests is, okay, now I've got some simple code that, it'll show a little bit of an activity spinner while it waits to load up. But when it's available, it will, sign me into Graph, get that Graph client object. And here you can see, rather than having to make REST calls, I get this structured, IntelliSensed API where I can say .me, .context, .request, .select. And so you can use all of the sort of the Visual Studio autocomplete type of semantics to, work your way through the REST APIs. You don't need to know the specific URLs or parse the specific bits of JSON. So in this case, there's a very simple just model here, I guess I would say, where it's going to pass in the display name and email address. And then as you can see, that list is actually bound to the item source of a component of a list view that will sort of then go show those list of contacts. So pretty easy, just shows you a little bit more of an example of using the Graph clients, the Graph SDKs to go access the data. And then when you click on it, it's going to take me to the files page, which will list all the files for the person at that given email address. So fairly simple. Now, the other thing you can do with this is there is an email option. So in my case, I'm just going to go send an email, and I'm going to say I'm going to send it to myself on Microsoft.com. That's the standard default email address that you kind of get if you don't have a signed in domain. I'm going to say, hello, Xamarin. Hi there. Click send. And so what this will do is it'll basically just do kind of a post request in my set of messages. It's sent the mail. So, all right. So now if I just go back to my Office 365, you can see that this email that I just sent out is now in my inbox and available. So, obviously email's the center of a lot of applications and or at least a notification mechanism or communication mechanism. So you can see how easy it can be to sort of integrate that email concept into your own applications, if nothing else. Okay, now the final example I'm going to show you is definitely a little bit more advanced. Sorry, before I do that, let me show you the code just real quick. Sorry. I have to show the code, that's the point, right? So again, fairly simple though. As you can see, we're going to get that graph client. We're going to create our new message, which is just a message object with a subject. We're going to create a new email address with a name and an address. Again, using the Graph SDK sort of structured objects to go do that. And then we're just going to say graph client.send email, which will essentially do that post. And it's using a wait asynchronous syntax to wait for that request to go through. And when it happens, of course, it'll send a message, just a simple alert. Now, obviously, you're going to want to add a lot of exception logic and those kinds of things and do a more sophisticated job there. But basically sending an email is probably as simple as you might expect. Give us a structured message object, an email address, and then call the .send mail API and you're good to go. Okay, next sample. Any other questions, by the way?
Yeah, there's a question. So with the Microsoft Graph, when a user is logged in to a native application that's connected to a tenant, is it possible to unblock the user if needed?
Unblock the user if needed.
Yeah, so I was going to say, Dashi, if you can maybe explain a little bit of what you mean by unblock there. See if we can get a clarification on that. But,
okay, I'll start up my next sample.
Yeah, while we're waiting, we'll come back to that question.
So in this case, I'm going to show just a very simple example of a property manager. So imagine you're a real estate agent. As a real estate agent, you're probably managing a number of different properties. These properties are the center of your universe. You want to, collaborate with your fellow real estate agents, maybe with your customers, to sort of work on those properties. And, all the things that you see inside of Office 365, files, tasks, communication, those are all really useful. So you want to leverage them as part of your real estate application. So what this application is going to do is basically for every property that we're looking to sell, it's going to create a Microsoft, it's going to create a group in Office 365 behind the scenes. And with that group, what it'll go do is it will, with that group, then you'll get all those collaboration facilities that come along with it. So you can see here, I've got a number of different properties that I'm managing, but in my case, I'm just going to go create a new property called, I don't know, 123 Main Street, obviously, Brady Bunch style, mid-century modern. I don't know a lot about architecture, but given the number of rooms, let's say it's 2,000 square feet and it's on a 10,000 foot lot and it costs $500 a year to operate, maybe taxes or what have you, if you're lucky. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a group behind the scenes, as I mentioned, inside of my Office 365 tenant. And then it's going to expose as an application a number of different windows and collaboration capabilities. So we imagine this is kind of a common pattern that a lot of applications are going to want to use, which is, you center around this concept of a group for managing all the stuff, if you will, in Office 365 that's associated with something that a user cares about. So, so now I've created 123 Main Street. You can see that here's my basic information, but then I can start to have conversations and say, hello world, like this, and hit send. And so now that's sent, and I can create a task called, put out signs, like so. All right. Got an exception, but let me just show you this really briefly. You can see that in Office 365, if I go to my SharePoint sites, you can see what happened behind the scenes is that when I created that group, and maybe that group wasn't fully created yet, but when I created that group, you can see that there's something for 123 Main Street here. There should be something for 123 Main Street. Right. Well, you can see some of the previous ones that I've created. Maybe it's still creating behind the scenes, but in this case, I just created one, and you'll see all the SharePoint sites and the artifacts. I uploaded some files, for example, to it, and those would show up inside of documents. You can see things like planner tasks, but basically this application provides sort of a good template of how you can work with all the different artifacts that are in Office 365. Planner tasks, for example, that planner task that I created for putting out real estate signs when I did it earlier. Maybe it's in 123 Main Street now. You can see it's created a planner group for me to sort of organize all my tasks, and that's where that task would have gone into. So that's just a very simple example. Just, you can download the code for it, but the interesting thing here is that you can see that, most of the actual logic is in this graph service class, and you can see that basically there's these structured model wrappers around, calls to graph endpoints to do things like retrieve the list of groups, retrieve the set of conversations, and so on. So I highly recommend the sample. It's actually a more comprehensive sample of, and hopefully it'll give you some ideas of what you can do. Okay, so we're running a little bit low on time, so I'm gonna go a little bit more quickly and just sort of summarize some slides. So on top of just an API surface, there's a number of capabilities that you can take advantage of. So in addition to the relationships between objects and query parameters, we also have in preview the ability to sort of batch requests. So you can actually request multiple things in one round trip, which as you're, I'm sure all aware, makes your application a lot more efficient because there's a lot of overhead in sending out requests. We have a concept of webhooks. So if you want to build services that sort of respond to changes inside of Microsoft Graph, maybe new emails come in, maybe new files are added to OneDrive, and in preview, maybe new users or groups are added, you can actually go ahead and get a outbound webhook to your web service that can do custom things. So maybe not directly relevant to Xamarin, but it's definitely a huge capability you should be aware of. You can do things like track changes. So if you want to synchronize data, you don't have to just pull all the data to say, has anything changed? You can get basically change logs and deltas. And then finally, we have a concept of extensions, which actually allows you to store custom data. So for example, for a user, maybe you want to track their certification or their real estate qualification. That's not something that's natively in Graph, but you can then associate that property with that user. Okay, so then the final thing I just want to share is a little bit of roadmap information. So the key punchline is the set of types of things that you can see inside of Microsoft Graph is expanding all the time to things like teams and SharePoint lists, as I showed you a little bit earlier, things like Office 365 reports, Intune data, etc. And from a capability perspective, we are continuing to expand the set of SDKs. We have more webhooks that are expanding. We have this sort of Delta query, these change lists that are available. So the set of things that are in Graph is sort of growing all the time. So if you come back in 3 months and you say, I want to go use Microsoft Graph, we'll probably have a lot more stuff that will be interesting and available to you. All right, so in addition, we just have some tooling updates. And if you haven't had a chance to play with the Graph Explorer, definitely go do so. So with that, probably going to wrap it up a little bit. There are some more slides that go into a little bit more detail of those capabilities, like the exact REST endpoints that are available in the slides that should be available later on. But if you want to, just simply go to graph.microsoft.com and you'll find plenty of things to experiment with. Of course, we're on Twitter and on GitHub. We have a lot of samples up there and on Stack Overflow as well. So with that, just wanted to sort of wrap up a little bit. And if there's questions, I'd love to take them.
Yeah, so great. So first of all, thank you. And we do have some more questions. So going back to that question about the user being blocked, if they get blocked, we have some clarification there. Is basically if the user tries to log in more than X number of times with the wrong password, the user gets blocked and they get denied.
I see.
Yeah. Things. Is it possible to automate that process to unblock it automatically?
Probably not right now. I mean, really if the user is blocked, then obviously when they sign in, they'll see some message and they'll probably have some experience that you can define through standard default ways to sort of, where they can go sort of, appeal to their manager or integrate with your custom, authentication system that's integrated with Office 365. To automate them, we are adding, for example, this ability to have webhooks for when user state changes. So I don't know whether specifically that's going to cover, like, for example, if they get blocked due to some, maybe, obviously they put in their password too many times. But in theory, if that capacity is in those webhooks, then you could hook up a service to respond to that kind of a change and then maybe do something to potentially unblock them. But I don't know the specific answer as to whether those preview webhooks include the, notification of when a user gets blocked. I think it should, but I can sort of, my email is mikeam@microsoft.com. So if you have that question, I can go dig to see whether the webhooks preview for users will sort of include blocking and whether that would be possible to do.
All right, great. One more. Can we develop custom modules in Microsoft Graph?
Custom modules. Well, maybe you want to clarify a little bit of what you mean, but the one thing that I will say is you can extend Microsoft Graph. And so this is the example that I sort of described very briefly, but kind of passed over. There's this concept of extensions from Microsoft Graph. So for a given person, you can then, associate all kinds of custom properties with a user. So in this case, it's, here's a concept of a referral, which is something that Graph doesn't have by itself, but you can associate that with emails in their inbox, for example. And there's also a more structured concept of extensions called schema extensions, where you can define a schema and there are certain data types that are available, and then you can associate them, for example, with a group. So in this case, it's not just a group, it's a training course, and so every training course has a course name and those kinds of things, and that allows you to do things like, for example, query all the groups that have this course name equal Math 101s. So in that regard, you can do these kind of data type of extensions and modules inside of Microsoft Graph, and it's actually a really powerful capability. I mean, again, think of all the core things that are in Office 365, like users and groups. It makes a ton of sense to extend it. Now, it's not a database, so you can't go nuts with it. I think there's a limit of 100 properties, and each property has like maybe some limit of, I don't know the exact limit, but like 1K of data or something. So you can't really go nuts with it. But even just that capacity sort of will allow you to build a lot of types of applications. So I'm not sure if that specifically answers your question around modules, but extensions can probably be the hook for a lot more to do module type things.
So the clarification is, can they define business rules and publish it to the graph like we can do in SharePoint?
So can you define business rules? So there isn't, like when I think of business rules, I think of things that sort of apply before an object gets committed that will reject that object, if it doesn't fit into the business rules, and that capacity doesn't exist. Now there is a webhook capability. Webhooks fire after an item has changed, so that you can do sort of conditional behavior, like for example, like look at the item. If it's not valid, maybe you delete the item, or you send an email, or you do something in response to that. Now, of course, there's always going to be a window of time by which that invalid object was in your graph for some time, which may or may not be a deal breaker depending on your business logic. So with webhooks, you can implement some sense of business logic after the fact. For some things like SharePoint, for example, you can have document libraries that are always in a checked out state until they're approved, and so you can actually even still use that to have a real business logic type of process. So I think in the definition of the word business logic, in terms of something that applies before an object gets committed, I think the answer is no, but you can do some things with webhooks, and hopefully that answers your questions.
Okay, great, thanks. So that does bring us to the end of our hour, and if anybody has any more questions, like Mike said, you can contact him, or you can contact us here at Xamarin University. Contact me, Rob Gibbons, if you'd like. And Mike, can we get your slides to post as well? Would that be right?
Yeah, I'll send them over to you.
Okay, so we'll get the recording of this session posted up on our Xamarin University site in about a month. It'll be public on YouTube, and I just want to say thank you again so much. It's really informative, and just in your demos, I started thinking of all these cool things that you could do with it, of coordination between teams and people, and there's lots that you can do.
Maybe I'm just a nerd for productivity, but like I said, my eyes light up like a kid in a candy store, so hopefully yours will as well.
Yes, definitely. So thank you again, Mike, and thank you for everyone for attending, and I hope you have a great day, and check out our upcoming guest lectures. We have 3 more in the next month. We have MVVM Cross, Prism, and Unity game development. So go check those out. Hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks a lot. All right.
Bye.